Greenland is not a secret military base, not an unclaimed land, and not for sale, yet it keeps returning to the center of American power politics. And this time, it's not happening in isolation. Just days after the United States carried out a dramatic intervention in Venezuela, President Donald Trump once again turned global attention north, reviving the idea that Greenland is something the U.S. needs for national security, not wants, needs. Denmark says the conversation has gone too far. Greenland's own leaders say the idea is a fantasy. European allies are openly warning that this line of thinking risks something much bigger than a diplomatic dispute. Why does Greenland keep coming back? What actually changed this time? And at what point does a repeated idea stop being rhetoric and start becoming a real geopolitical problem? The moment Greenland re-entered the spotlight. To understand why Greenland suddenly feels urgent again, timing matters. In the days following the U.S. military operation in Venezuela, an operation that resulted in the capture of President Nicolas Maduro and his transfer to New York, President Trump publicly declared that the United States would temporarily run Venezuela, with American oil companies playing a central role in its future. According to publicly available statements, this move was framed as necessary for stability and security. But for America's allies, it sent a very different signal, because almost immediately after, the focus shifted, not south, but north. Speaking to reporters, Trump stated that the United States needs Greenland from the standpoint of national security, not as a proposal, not as a long-term discussion. As a necessity. That single word is what triggered alarm across Europe. Denmark's response: "That's enough now." Denmark's Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, responded with unusual directness. She publicly stated that the United States has no right to annex any part of the Danish kingdom, including Greenland, emphasizing that Denmark and Greenland are both protected under NATO's collective defense guarantees. Greenland's Prime Minister, Jens Frederik Nielsen, went even further. No more pressure. No more insinuations. No more fantasies of annexation. His words were careful but unmistakably firm. Greenland, while semi-autonomous, has its own government, its own political identity, and a population that, according to opinion polls, overwhelmingly opposes becoming part of the United States. In fact, this wasn't just a disagreement over policy. It was a boundary being drawn. Why this feels different from 2019. This isn't the first time Trump has spoken about Greenland. Back in 2019, the idea of buying the island was widely dismissed as unconventional, even humorous in some circles. It was treated as a symbolic expression of Trump's deal-making worldview, rather than a real strategic plan. But this time, several elements have changed. First, the language has shifted. This is no longer about a transaction. It's about security. Second, the geopolitical context is far more tense. The war in Ukraine continues to reshape European security thinking. The Arctic is opening up due to climate change, increasing competition over shipping routes and resources. And U.S. allies are watching American actions, not just words, more closely than ever. When statements about Greenland came after a real-world military intervention elsewhere, they landed differently. Then came a moment that, on its own, might seem minor, but diplomatically carried weight. Katie Miller, the wife of Trump advisor Stephen Miller, posted a map of Greenland colored like the American flag, with a single word underneath: soon. The Danish ambassador to the U.S. responded with what he described as a friendly reminder, noting that Denmark and the United States are allies, and that respect for territorial integrity matters. But the message was clear. This was no longer being treated as a joke. Shortly after, Stephen Miller himself stated publicly that it was the formal position of the U.S. government that Greenland should be part of the United States, arguing that it was necessary for NATO's Arctic security. That statement alone raised a critical question among European leaders. If Greenland is already protected by NATO, why would annexation be necessary at all? So if Greenland isn't for sale, if Denmark is already a NATO ally, and if the US already has military access to the island, what exactly is really at stake here? To answer that, you have to look beyond politics and toward geography. Greenland sits between North America and Europe, deep inside the Arctic Circle. It lies along the shortest routes between the two continents and near the so-called GI-UK gap, a critical corridor used to monitor naval movement in the North Atlantic. This has mattered since World War II. The United States has operated a military base in Greenland for decades, now known as Pituffik Space Base, under a 1951 defense agreement with Denmark. The base supports missile warning systems, space surveillance, and early detection infrastructure. In other words, the U.S. already has a significant presence there. Which raises the next question. If access already exists, why push for ownership? Security alone doesn't fully explain the urgency. So what else does Greenland represent? Especially now. The answer lies beneath the ice. Greenland holds deposits of rare earth minerals, materials critical for smartphones, batteries, renewable energy systems, and advanced defense technology. Globally, China dominates rare earth processing and supply chains. Reducing reliance on that system has been a long-standing goal of U.S. policy across multiple administrations. From that perspective, Greenland represents potential. But potential is not the same as control. Mining in Greenland is difficult, expensive, and heavily regulated, partly due to environmental concerns and local political resistance. These constraints complicate any simple narrative about rapid resource extraction. Still, in a world where supply chains are increasingly weaponized, even the idea of future access carries strategic weight. But minerals and bases are only part of the picture. Because the moment this discussion crossed from economics into sovereignty, it stopped being a US-Denmark issue and became a test of the entire NATO alliance. Within days, leaders from the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Poland, and Denmark released a joint statement. Their message was unified. Greenland belongs to its people. Only Denmark and Greenland can decide its future. And Arctic security must be handled collectively, while respecting international law. This wasn't anti-American rhetoric. The statement explicitly reaffirmed the United States as an essential NATO partner, but it also drew a clear red line. Any attempt to change borders by pressure or force would undermine the alliance itself. Some European defense experts went further, warning publicly that such a move could effectively end NATO as it currently exists, not because of military confrontation, but because trust would collapse. So now the situation stands at an uncomfortable intersection. A USO. President insisting Greenland is a security necessity. Allies insisting sovereignty is non-negotiable. And a world already strained by conflict, competition, and shifting power. Which brings us to the most important question of all. If this isn't about buying land, and it isn't about immediate military access, then what does annexation actually change? And where does this logic end? Why Venezuela changed how allies interpret Greenland? On paper, Venezuela and Greenland have nothing in common. Different continents, different political systems, different histories. But in diplomacy, perception often matters more than geography. According to publicly available statements, the U.S. intervention in Venezuela was justified as a matter of security, stability, and accountability. The operation was swift, decisive, and framed as necessary to protect broader regional interests. For many European governments, however, the key issue wasn't the justification, it was the precedent. Because for the first time in years, a sitting U.S. president openly described removing a foreign leader and temporarily managing a country's future as acceptable policy. So when Greenland resurfaced in official language just days later, framed again as a necessity, allies began connecting the dots, not as a conspiracy, not as an accusation, but as a pattern worth watching. If security language can justify intervention in one place, what limits exist when that same language is applied somewhere else? For decades, the Arctic was viewed as a zone of cooperation rather than confrontation. That era is ending. As ice coverage recedes, new shipping routes are opening, cutting travel time between Asia, Europe, and North America. At the same time, access to energy and mineral resources is becoming more feasible. Russia has expanded military infrastructure along its Arctic coastline. China has declared itself a near-Arctic state and promoted a polar Silk Road. NATO has increased surveillance and joint exercises in response. In this environment, Greenland's position becomes more than symbolic. It sits at the crossroads of early warning systems, transatlantic defense routes, and emerging economic corridors. Any shift in control, even theoretical, has ripple effects across the entire alliance system. This is why European leaders insist Arctic security must remain collective, not unilateral. NATO's foundation rests on a simple promise: an attack on one is an attack on all. But what happens when tension emerges inside the alliance? Denmark is a NATO member. Greenland is part of the Danish kingdom. The United States is NATO's most powerful member. This creates a scenario NATO was never designed to handle. European officials have been careful with their words, emphasizing dialogue and law. But privately, defense analysts have warned that even sustained pressure, not force, could weaken the alliance by eroding trust. And trust in NATO is everything. So if annexation would destabilize NATO, and if Greenland's people oppose it, why keep returning to the idea at all? To understand the persistence of the Greenland narrative, you have to understand how Donald Trump approaches power. Throughout his presidency, Trump has viewed alliances less as permanent commitments and more as negotiations. In that framework, leverage matters more than reassurance. Greenland, from this perspective, is leverage. It intersects with NATO funding debates. It pressures Denmark on defense contributions. It signals strength to rivals watching Arctic developments. And it reinforces a message to domestic audiences about prioritizing American security interests. Whether or not annexation is realistic becomes secondary to the pressure created by discussing it. But that strategy carries risks. Because leverage only works as long as the other side believes you might actually use it. Amid all this, Greenland's own voice is often the quietest and the most important. With a population of around 57,000 people, Greenland has pursued gradual self-governance for decades. Defense and foreign policy remain with Denmark, but domestic political identity has grown stronger over time. Most Greenlanders favor eventual independence, but polls consistently show overwhelming opposition to becoming part of the United States. Greenland's leaders have repeatedly emphasized openness to dialogue on security, trade, and cooperation, while rejecting any discussion that bypasses international law or popular consent. For them, the issue is not geopolitics, it's agency. If Greenland wants more autonomy, not annexation, if Denmark wants cooperation, not confrontation, and if Europe wants stability, then what outcome is actually possible? Despite the intensity of recent statements, most analysts agree on one point: formal annexation is extremely unlikely. The legal barriers are immense. The diplomatic cost would be historic, and the strategic fallout would outweigh any short-term gains. What is far more likely is a continuation of pressure, rhetorical, political, and strategic, aimed at expanding U.S. influence in the Arctic without formally redrawing borders. That could mean increased U.S. military investment in Greenland, expanded surveillance and early warning infrastructure, greater demands on Denmark within NATO, and more visible signaling to Russia and China. In other words, control without ownership. But even that raises a final question, one that allies are now asking quietly, but seriously. At what point does pressure become policy? And at what point does repetition turn normalization into risk? Because once certain ideas enter official language often enough, they begin to reshape expectations, even if they never become reality. The bigger picture. Greenland isn't just about ice, minerals, or military bases. It's about how power is expressed in a world where alliances are strained, competition is rising, and security language carries enormous weight. The real danger isn't annexation itself. It's what happens when boundaries, legal, diplomatic, and rhetorical, start to blur. And that's why European leaders, Greenland's government, and international institutions are responding so firmly now before ambiguity turns into assumption. The Greenland question may not end with a flag change, but it may mark a turning point in how the U.S. defines necessity, how allies define trust, and how smaller regions protect their voice in a world of great powers. Because once the idea of needing territory enters global politics, the hardest part is deciding where it stops.
Well, I don't want to talk about Greenland. Let's talk about Venezuela, Russia, Ukraine, and we'll worry about Greenland in about 2 months. Let's talk about Greenland in 20 days.
On Venezuela, we talk so much about energy.
By the way, I will say this about Greenland. We need Greenland from a national security situation. It's so strategic. Right now, Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships all over the place. We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security. And Denmark is not going to be able to do it, I can tell you.
I think it's a big one.
You know what Denmark did recently to boost up security in Greenland? They added one more dog sled. It's true. They thought that was a great move. I just say this. We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security. And the European Union needs us to have it, and they know that.